And after the Great War, the 9 worlds were rent apart, and all the blood of creation, burning hot, was bubbling through. And Odin and the Vanes looked upon it, and they looked upon it as something beautiful. And they smiled, and in the smile the world started to heal. And then the Vanes and the Aesir swore eternal companionship. And they spat out their conflict and their blood, their fire and their anger, in the new beauty of their love. And their spit hit a certain patch of lava, perhaps the last, as the world healed. And it seemed for a moment that the lava went out. But as the gods watched, it changed. It became a figure, a beautiful man, who came up to them full of joy. His eyes seemed to hold a wisdom deeper than the roots of time. And in a voice as deep, he said, "I am Kavar." And Kavar started to sing them the song of creation, sing them the song of their own deeds, but set amongst the greater deeds of fire giants and storm giants, of old powers and new. And the gods and the Vanes stood entranced, perhaps for millennia. And at the end of the song, before they could thank him even, Kavar had gone. And he, the wisest that had ever been, made from the blood, tears and words of gods, but created from the very roots of the world, went amongst elves and dwarves and men, in the twist and in the tumult, giving them wisdom, giving them kindness, for he was a word master. Whatever the problem, whatever the crisis, by new words he allowed people to forge it anew in their minds, so that all problems seemed solvable, all fears could be contained, all hatred could be located, all joy could be celebrated. And so for a long while after the Great War, there was peace in the 9 worlds. Even Surt in the south and Thrym in the north felt it in their hearts. Everywhere, save amongst the 2 dwarf brothers. Oh, we can call them together the bastards, Breggy and Braggy. Now, those bastards were the master smiths. They made items of war, helmets and swords, but less wholesome items. For they made items for quick confession, torture implements you might call them. And before the war, they had done very, very well. For all the twist and all the chaos, everybody needs a good rack. And the brothers had laughed in their nasty way as their gold grew great. But now wisdom ruled, as the kind words of Kavar taught everyone how to think afresh, and war died down and peace reigned. The dwarves thought, this is no good for business. As our names are Bastard, we will have our business back. And so it was, they let it known that they had a problem that needed the wisest of all heads to solve. And the wisest of all heads came to them, himself. He, the master of words, Kavar. And he stood before them and said, I have heard that you need counsel. Tell me your problems. And the dwarf said, oh, we will. But first, let us have a beer together, for problems feel better with a beer. And they poured great flagons of dwarf beer, black and smoking. Now, dwarf beer is not for anyone other than dwarfs. And if Kavar had thought about it, he might have said no. But he had a weakness, and that weakness was kindness. And so he took up his goblet, meaning to only drink a little, but the dwarves spilt the rest into his mouth, and before he knew quite what had happened, he had swallowed it. "I'll help you when I wake up." And he fell asleep. Then the dwarves got out their greatest black axe and smote off his head, laughing, and said, "We knew we needed the head of the wise." And then they poured out his blood in mighty, mighty flagons, mixing it with their beer and also with their mead, that it might make a heady brew, a brew in which all the wisdom of the world might be found. And the dwarves smiled their hate as the world pitched back to war. Up in heaven, Kevar was missed, for Odin's friend Mimir, on whom he had set his eye, could see the future. And with that, Odin could see the future too, but he could not find words for it. He needed the words to make plans, to help the fates of gods. And without the god of wisdom at his side, from time to time, he could not find the words himself. And now that god was missing amongst the ways of the world. And Odin climbed up the high yew tree, Yggdrasil, and climbed in its branches and looked down, and saw nothing. And then he went to Mimir, and Mimir said, when the time comes, you will hear the wolf howl. And Odin rubbed the socket that had been his eye and wondered at it. Meanwhile, the dwarves were spreading discord. There was a particular giant whose hair they loved the look of. "Oh, that's fine golden hair that giant has," they would say to themselves again and again, until at last they hatched their plan. They forged a boat made of bronze, and at the poop of that boat they put a second boat that could break off. For the first boat was meant in the midst of the ocean to fold in on itself, to become a prison, and to sink and drown who was ever inside. And then the two dwarfs, in a rudimentary disguise, went down to the giant. Now the giant was one of those that lived in western Norway and earned their living fishing in the great ocean. And they said to the giant, "We're good crewmen, and this is the best boat you will ever have seen, for it is fine dwarven work. It is made out of bronze and brass." And the giant looked at the boat, and it was indeed made of metal. "Well, I never," he said. "What do you say to that?" "What's more," said the dwarves, "it follows our words. We just command it to go and it goes. We will sit up there in the poop, and you get out all your fishing tackle and the rest of it, and we'll go into the ocean, and I bet you catch a kraken." And the giant smiled and said, "Well, I bet I do." And they sailed far into the ocean, and just as the giant was about to put out his net and said to one of the dwarves, "Oh, could you help me?" And the dwarf reached down to the poop and grabbed hold of the neck, the other dwarf whispered, "Now, now, now, Kayan, Kayak!" Folding in on the giant, sunk deep in the ocean he was, but not so deep that his nets could not catch him. So the cunning dwarfs, when they were certain he was dead, caught him in one of his own nets, bringing up the boat and the body, and sailed ashore and scalped him, and weaved his beautiful golden mane into new tapestries and new joys, new treasures, to fill the world with woe and envy. But the son of that great giant, Surtirong, missed his father, and seeing in the cloak so Thrym And the other giants, this golden thread, he asked where they got it, and they would all say the same. There was two dwarven brothers, the bastards. They live whereabouts? And so Sertang looked for them long, until he came to a certain market, perhaps in the east, where he saw two little sellers selling golden thread, and he knew he'd got his mark. And before they could escape him, he caught them both by the neck, and he rammed their heads together and said, "Did you kill my father to get this hair?" And the dwarf said, "No, it wasn't us, it was somebody else." Just then, one of the humans walking by said, No, you said it was you that made them." And the dwarfs muttered, "No!" The giant got ready to bash their brains out on rocks. The dwarf said, "Our lives are worth nothing, I tell you. We can give you what even the gods would treasure, the mead we brewed from the holy blood, the Skaldic Mead, in which lies all the wisdom of the world." The giant said, "Take it." And it was true, the dwarves had 3 great flagons, and in those flagons they'd put all the blood of Cavar, and brewed it, and made it into a glorious, sparkling drink. And the giant smiled, for here was a treasure indeed. And he took the flagons, sparing the dwarves with one more great beating, so that they would never leave their caves again, but would remain alive. He went back to his home, and he set the flagons inside a great mountain. And there he put his beautiful daughter in charge, walling her up, telling her, "Guard those, and when you've guarded them long enough, I'll let you out to marry." And the maiden sat guarding the flagons. Well, Sertang was sure the gods would want the drink, and so sometimes he would wander up there on the hill, and sometimes he would let his brother Bravar wander. But they were happy in their knowledge that all the wisdom of the world was theirs, and lay in the deep flagons. Well, up in heaven, the minute the flagons were set on the mountain, he climbed up to Mimir, and laid his hand on Mimir's head, and he suddenly saw the mountain. He knew where it was, in northern Norway. And so, becoming a little man, he descended Billafrost, there in the far north, wondering how he could get past the giants, who were so huge that even the Allfather feared their grasp. He was thinking that when he looked and saw 9 men. Now those 9 men he had known, for he had been spying out the lands, were servants of Bragi, one of the brothers, the younger of the 2. And the 9 men's job it was to plough a field, for that giant lived off the crop. And the 9 men had a plough that was fairly blunt and ineffective. And the Allfather, pulling a cloak over his head, came down and said, "Let me sharpen your plough for you." And he put out the whetstone, and he sharpened it and sharpened it and sharpened it. For that was the whetstone of heaven that would make every blade sharper than time. And then one of the workmen said, "Oh, that looks good." And he tried the blade, and it cut him. And he said, "Wow. Now with this plough I will be the greatest farmer of them all." But all the other 7 men, all 8 others, said, "No, that plough belongs to us." Soon they got biting, and the Allfather disappeared, but he left only the whetstone. And then, knowing that the whetstone would make them wealthy men, for in northern Norway sharpening is a fine art, and those with the stone powerful enough become rich and influential men. And infected perhaps with some divine fury, the 9 servant men started fighting, bashing each other with a plough, sharpening what daggers they had, slaying each other in hot hate and anger, as all the fury of the years broke upon their souls, until they were all dead. And the giant, coming soon after, said, "What? How will my field be ploughed?" And just then a stranger came behind him and said, "I'll do all that." And he looked, and there seemed to be a little mortal man with a deep hood over his head, so that you could only see his beard out of the shadows. "All right," said the giant. "If you can, I will give you whatever reward you want." And the little man smiled and said, "I shall do the work." And for a year and a day he worked for the giant, and whatever the giant wanted, it was done. It was the finest crop he had ever had. It was the best beer he had ever brewed. His horses were broken in better and faster than ever before. Even serpents could be summoned from the sea. And at the end of a year and a day, the figure came before him and said, "Now, for my pay, I want 3 sips of the Skaldic Mead your brother has in the mountain." And the brother, Bragi, said, "Well, I'm not sure about that. I'll have to go and ask him." So he went south where Skaldic lived. And when Skaldic heard of the deeds of the stranger, he grew angry and said, "That's a god! That's a god! That's not a man! That's Thor or even the Valfather. You cannot help him. We must rather kill him." And he set a fire in his brother's heart, making him loathe the gods. So when the Bragi went back, he was determined, somehow or other, to trick the little stranger. But all he would say is, "My brother will not give it, but perhaps we can get it. For he is a lazy man and sleeps in the afternoon." And so it was the next afternoon, the Valfather, still in his disguise, and the giant Bragi stood upon the mountain. It is in there, but we can't get it," said the giant. But just then Odin pulled out from his deep cloak a great awl, a screw, with a blade so long it could pierce as far as you could drill. And then he turned to the giant and said, "You are mighty enough to wield this. Turn it against the mountain rock." Now the giant turned it, but he meant to catch Odin in the prison of the rock. So after a little while he said, I think it's gone through." And Odin smiled, looked down, and he couldn't tell, but rather he blew dust into the hole, and the dust came back, and he knew that it was a trap, that if he could go down into that hole, he would be caught. And he said, "No, deeper still." And twice more Bragi stopped and said, "I think it is deep enough." And twice more Odin checked it, until at last the dust came down. And then the giant, with a nasty smile, for he knew the hole was too small for a man, said, "Put your head in, see if you can see the bottom." And Odin changed into a snake and was gone. And as a snake he wormed deep inside the world. It became hot, and he came across a mighty chamber, and there sleeping was a beautiful, beautiful giant maiden, utterly lovely and bereft, alone in all the world. And Odin let out a tear for what he must do, and it became as it were a diamond. And then, becoming his true form, but perhaps more handsome, he came up to the maiden and he kissed her on the lips, and she woke up, and he gave her the diamond and said, "Have this diamond of tears to be, as it were, a bridal troth, for I have come far to meet you, my darling." And she smiled and said, "Oh, strangers, we don't often get them. Is there anything I can get you? Are you tired? Are you hungry?" And Odin smiled and said, "Well, I am very, very thirsty, for it is very hot here near the Worth Centre. I would have a drink." And the woman said, "There is nothing to drink here but that mead." And Odin said, before she could finish, "I will have but 3 little gulps, one from each casket, one from each great container, and nobody will notice." And the girl agreed. But Odin is Odin, and 1 little gulp for him is a great gulp for a giant. 3 times he put to his lips the flagons and drunk all the mead dry. And before the girl could scream or shout, he changed. He changed first back into a little worm. And although he was fat, and it was harder, and he was longer, and he had to squeeze himself, now he was an earthworm. As an earthworm, he travelled through the hole as she raged about treachery from the other side. The giants, hearing that, turned themselves into dragons. And fearing that above him, Odin turned himself into a falcon. Faster than thought, he flew to heaven. faster than the great dragons, who came screaming after him, fast enough to come upon Bifrost to call the great alarm. Fire foes! Awake! Awake! Poured down the ice upon the dragons, freezing them there on the wing, and the giants fell to the earth and shattered. And Odin took the mead to himself. But men said some mead squeezed out when he was a worm, squeezing through the ocean, squeezing through the rock. And some he had to let go when he was flying as a bird, for otherwise he would have been too fat, and it fell upon the world and became words of wisdom and words of poetry, words of power and words of glory. But also, he poured out urine as well, for he needed to pee, so much had he drunk, and some words, some of the wisdom mixed with the piss of urine of Odin, and that became bad words, ill advice and poor poetry. So sometimes it is hard to tell the two apart. But the gods forgot not their treachery, and when it came time to build Asgard's walls again, built them all the higher for the fear they had bred in the world. While in the far mountain, the giantess changed. Fingering her diamond, she put it in her heart. She became hard-hearted Agnaboda, mother of the death of the gods.